The morning sun cast long shadows across the rugged mountains of Afghanistan as Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez checked her gear one final time. At 5 feet 2 inches and weighing barely 120 pounds, she looked almost fragile among the towering male soldiers surrounding her. But appearances could be deceiving. Maria had earned her place in this elite unit through years of grueling training, unwavering determination, and a heart that refused to give up when others might falter. The mission briefing had been straightforward enough. Their team of 12 would move through the treacherous mountain passes to reach a strategic observation post overlooking a valley known to harbor enemy activity. Intelligence reports suggested the area was mostly clear, but in Afghanistan, intelligence could change as quickly as the weather in these unforgiving peaks. Maria had grown up in a small town in Texas, the daughter of a mechanic and a school teacher. She was the youngest of 4 children, with 3 older brothers who had treated her like just another one of the boys. This upbringing had taught her to be tough, to stand her ground, and never to back down from a challenge. When her eldest brother joined the Marines, Maria knew she wanted to serve too, but she wanted to push herself even further. The Army had been skeptical at first. Women in combat roles were still controversial, and many questioned whether someone of Maria's small stature could handle the physical demands of frontline duty. But Maria had something that couldn't be measured in height or weight, an unbreakable spirit and a deep sense of duty that drove her to excel in every training exercise, every qualification test, and every challenge her instructors threw at her. Her journey to this mountain in Afghanistan had been long and difficult. Basic training had nearly broken her physically, but she had refused to quit. Advanced infantry training had pushed her to limits she didn't know she had. Ranger school had been brutal, with instructors who seemed determined to prove that women didn't belong in elite units. But Maria had graduated, one of the first women to complete the program, earning the respect of even her harshest critics. Now, 3 years into her military career, she found herself part of a joint operation with Navy SEALs, some of the most elite warriors in the American military. The SEALs had been initially surprised to see a woman assigned to their mission, but Maria's reputation had preceded her. Her commanding officers had specifically requested her for this operation, knowing that her small size could be an advantage in the tight mountain passes they would navigate, and her proven courage under fire made her invaluable to any team. The team leader, Lieutenant Commander Jake Thompson, was a veteran SEAL with over a decade of experience in special operations. At 6 feet 4 inches and built like a linebacker, he was the physical opposite of Maria, but he had quickly recognized her competence and professionalism. During the mission planning, he had listened carefully to her suggestions about route selection and movement techniques, understanding that her different perspective could provide valuable insights. Sergeant First Class David Kim, the team medic, had worked with Maria on 2 previous operations. He appreciated her attention to detail and her ability to remain calm under pressure. David had seen too many soldiers, both male and female, crack when the shooting started, but Maria had always been steady as a rock. Her presence actually made him feel more confident about the mission ahead. The rest of the team consisted of experienced special operations soldiers, each bringing unique skills to the mission. There was Staff Sergeant Mike O'Brien, a demolitions expert who could make explosives from household items, Sergeant Alex Petrov, a communications specialist who spoke 3 languages fluently, and Corporal Tommy Williams, a sniper whose accuracy with a rifle bordered on supernatural. As they moved out from their forward operating base in the pre-dawn darkness, Maria felt the familiar weight of her gear settling into place. Her pack contained ammunition, water, medical supplies, and specialized equipment for their mission. The total weight was nearly 60 pounds, significant for someone of her size, but she had trained extensively with heavy loads and moved with the same fluid grace as her larger teammates. The initial phase of their movement went smoothly. They followed established paths through the lower elevations, making good time toward their objective. The terrain was challenging but manageable, with rocky outcroppings providing cover and concealment as they advanced. Maria moved in the middle of the formation, her position chosen to maximize her ability to provide support to the team while keeping her protected from potential threats. The mountains of Afghanistan were both beautiful and deadly. Ancient peaks rose like jagged teeth against the sky, their slopes covered with loose rock that could shift without warning. Hidden valleys contained villages that might be friendly or hostile, with no way to know which until contact was made. The weather could change from clear skies to blinding snow in minutes, and the altitude made every step more difficult than it would be at sea level. As the sun climbed higher, the team encountered their first significant obstacle. The path they had planned to use had been blocked by a recent rock slide, forcing them to find an alternate route. Lieutenant Commander Thompson gathered the team for a quick tactical discussion, spreading a map on a flat rock and pointing out their options. Maria studied the terrain features carefully, noting the elevation changes and potential choke points. She suggested a route that would take them slightly further north, following a ridge line that would provide good observation, but would be more exposed to enemy fire if they encountered resistance. The team leader considered her recommendation, weighing the risks and benefits before making his decision. They chose Maria's route, and she felt a surge of pride at having her tactical judgment validated by such an experienced leader. This was what she had worked so hard for, to be seen not as a woman trying to keep up with men, but as a soldier whose opinions and skills were valued by her peers. The climb to the ridge line tested everyone's physical conditioning. The loose rock made every step treacherous, and the increasing altitude made breathing more difficult. Maria's smaller size actually proved advantageous here, as she could pick her way through narrow passages that forced her larger teammates to find alternate paths. Several times, she was able to scout ahead and identify safe routes that the entire team could follow. Halfway up the ridge, they encountered their first sign of enemy activity. Sergeant Petrov spotted movement in a valley below through his binoculars, a group of armed men moving toward what appeared to be a weapons cache hidden among the rocks. The team went into immediate action, taking defensive positions while Lieutenant Commander Thompson called in the sighting to headquarters. Maria found herself behind a large boulder, her rifle trained on the valley below. Through her scope, she could see the enemy fighters moving with the confidence of people who believe they own these mountains. She counted at least 8 men, all carrying automatic weapons and what appeared to be rocket-propelled grenades. This was exactly the type of enemy activity their mission was designed to identify and eliminate. The decision came quickly from headquarters: engage and destroy the enemy force. The team began moving into attack positions, using the elevation advantage to plan their assault. Maria's role would be to provide covering fire while the SEALs maneuvered into position for the main attack. It was a standard tactical operation, one they had rehearsed many times in training. As they prepared for contact, Maria felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came before combat. Her heart rate increased, but her breathing remained controlled. Her hands were steady on her weapon, and her mind was focused entirely on the mission ahead. This was what all her training had prepared her for, the moment when theory became reality and lives hung in the balance. The enemy fighters below had no idea they were being watched. They moved carelessly, talking among themselves and making no effort at tactical discipline. It was clear they believed themselves safe in these remote mountains, far from any American forces. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Lieutenant Commander Thompson gave the hand signal to initiate the attack. The morning silence was shattered by the controlled violence of professional soldiers doing what they did best. Maria's rifle cracked repeatedly as she engaged targets below, each shot carefully aimed and deliberate. She watched through her scope as enemy fighters scrambled for cover, their relaxed movements suddenly becoming desperate attempts to survive. The firefight was brief, but intense. The enemy fighters, caught in the open by disciplined fire from above, had little chance to mount an effective defense. Within minutes, the valley below was silent again, the enemy force neutralized with military precision. It had been a textbook operation, executed flawlessly by a team of professionals at the top of their game. As they prepared to continue their mission, Maria felt the satisfaction that came from successful completion of a difficult task. She had proven herself once again in combat, demonstrating that her place in this elite unit was earned through skill and courage, not charity or political correctness. The enemy fighters who had threatened American forces would never do so again, and that knowledge filled her with quiet pride. But the day was far from over, and the most challenging part of their mission still lay ahead. The mountain peaks above them rose like sleeping giants, their slopes promising even more treacherous terrain and unknown dangers. As the team reorganized and prepared to continue their advance, none of them could imagine the test of courage and endurance that awaited them in the hours to come. The radio crackled with updated intelligence from headquarters. New enemy movements had been detected further up the mountain, suggesting that their target area was more heavily defended than originally believed. The mission parameters remained unchanged, but the level of risk had just increased significantly. Maria checked her ammunition supply and adjusted her gear, preparing for whatever challenges the mountain might throw at them next. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the rocky slopes as the team climbed higher into the Afghan mountains. The altitude was beginning to affect everyone, with the thin air making each step more laborious than the last. Maria's legs burned with the effort, but she maintained her position in the formation, refusing to show any signs of weakness that might cause her teammates to question her ability to keep up. The landscape around them had become increasingly desolate and forbidding. Gone were the scattered patches of vegetation they had seen at lower elevations, replaced by nothing but bare rock and loose scree that shifted treacherously underfoot. The silence was profound, broken only by the sound of boots on stone and the occasional whisper of wind through the peaks above them. Lieutenant Commander Thompson called for a brief rest in the shelter of an overhanging cliff. The team gratefully dropped their packs and took the opportunity to drink water and check their equipment. The mission was proceeding according to plan, but the physical demands of the terrain were taking their toll on everyone. Even the most conditioned athletes would struggle with the combination of altitude, weight, and treacherous footing they were dealing with. Maria used the break to study the terrain ahead through her binoculars. The route would take them across an exposed ridge line where they would be visible to anyone watching from the surrounding peaks. It was a calculated risk, but the alternate routes would add hours to their journey and potentially expose them to other dangers. Speed was essential to the success of their mission, and they couldn't afford unnecessary delays. Sergeant Kim, the medic, moved among the team members, checking for signs of altitude sickness or other problems that might compromise their effectiveness. He paid particular attention to Maria, not because he doubted her capabilities, but because her smaller body mass made her potentially more susceptible to the effects of extreme altitude. She passed his informal medical check without any concerns, her vital signs strong, and her mental state alert and focused. As they prepared to move out again, intelligence updates continued to flow through their radio. Enemy activity in the target area had increased significantly, with multiple groups of fighters converging on their objective. What had started as a routine reconnaissance mission was evolving into something much more dangerous. The team might find themselves significantly outnumbered when they reached their destination. The climb resumed with increased urgency. They needed to reach their observation post before the enemy forces could establish defensive positions that would make the mission impossible to complete. Maria pushed herself harder, her competitive nature refusing to allow the altitude and terrain to slow her down. She had trained for exactly these conditions, spending countless hours in mountain warfare schools and high-altitude training facilities. The exposed ridge crossing proved to be as dangerous as anticipated. Halfway across the narrow spine of rock, enemy fire erupted from concealed positions in the surrounding peaks. The crack of rifle shots echoed through the mountains as bullets struck the rocks around the advancing Americans. The team immediately took defensive positions, using whatever cover the rocky terrain could provide. Maria found herself behind a small outcropping of stone, return fire snapping over her head as she tried to locate the enemy shooters. Through her scope, she could see muzzle flashes from at least 3 different positions, indicating a well-planned ambush. The enemy fighters had chosen their ground carefully, occupying positions that provided excellent fields of fire while offering substantial protection from return fire. Lieutenant Commander Thompson's voice crackled over the radio as he coordinated the team's response to the ambush. The SEALs began executing practiced counter-ambush procedures, using fire and movement to break contact with the enemy while minimizing their own exposure. It was a delicate balance between maintaining aggressive offensive action and avoiding unnecessary casualties. The firefight lasted for nearly 20 minutes, with both sides trading shots across the rocky terrain. Maria's marksmanship training proved invaluable as she engaged targets at extreme range, her shots forcing enemy fighters to keep their heads down and disrupting their ability to maintain effective fire on the advancing Americans. Several times, she thought she saw one of her rounds find its mark, but the distance made it impossible to be certain. Finally, the enemy fire began to slacken as the Americans' superior training and equipment began to tell. One by one, the enemy positions fell silent, either because the fighters had been neutralized or because they had decided to withdraw to fight another day. Lieutenant Commander Thompson gave the signal to resume movement, and the team quickly crossed the remaining exposed terrain to reach the safety of the far ridge. The successful breaking of the ambush filled Maria with a mixture of relief and professional satisfaction. She had performed her role effectively under extreme stress, proving once again that her place in this elite unit was justified by her abilities rather than any political considerations. The enemy fighters who had tried to stop their advance had learned the hard way that American Special Operations Forces were not easily intimidated. But their troubles were far from over. As they descended into a narrow valley that would provide concealed approach to their objective, Sergeant Petrov picked up radio chatter indicating that enemy reinforcements were moving into the area. The original intelligence estimates of enemy strength had been dangerously low, and the team now faced the possibility of being surrounded by superior numbers. The valley floor was a maze of boulders and deep ravines carved by centuries of flash floods and erosion. It provided excellent concealment for their movement, but it also created perfect conditions for additional ambushes. The team moved more slowly now, with scouts advancing carefully to check each potential danger area before the main group followed. Maria's role in the formation had evolved during the day's fighting. Her demonstrated competence under fire had earned her increased responsibility, and she now found herself serving as one of the primary scouts for the team. Her smaller size allowed her to move through tight spaces that might challenge her larger teammates, and her sharp eyes had already spotted several potential threats before they could develop into problems. The climb out of the valley toward their final objective was the most challenging terrain they had encountered. The slope was nearly vertical in places, requiring the use of climbing ropes and specialized techniques that tested everyone's mountaineering skills. Maria's rock climbing experience from her youth in Texas served her well here, as she was able to find handholds and footholds that allowed her to assist her teammates in their ascent. As they neared the summit where their observation post would be established, the sound of helicopters echoed through the mountains. At first, they hoped it might be American aircraft providing support, but the distinctive sound of Soviet-era helicopters quickly identified them as enemy aircraft. The team took cover among the rocks as two armed helicopters swept through the valley below, clearly searching for the American force. The helicopters made several passes through the area, their crews obviously aware that American forces were operating somewhere in the mountains, but unable to locate the well-concealed team. Maria pressed herself against the cold stone, controlling her breathing and remaining motionless as the aircraft passed overhead. Discovery at this point would be catastrophic, leaving them exposed on a mountainside with nowhere to run. After what seemed like an eternity, the helicopters departed, their sound fading as they moved to search other areas. The team remained in place for several more minutes, ensuring that the aircraft were truly gone before resuming their movement. The close call had been a stark reminder of how vulnerable they were in this hostile environment, far from any possibility of immediate support. The final approach to their observation post required them to traverse a narrow ledge carved into the face of a cliff. The path was barely wide enough for a single person, with a sheer drop of several hundred feet on one side and solid rock on the other. One misstep would mean certain death, but there was no alternative route that would get them to their objective before darkness fell. Maria moved across the ledge with careful deliberation, testing each foothold before committing her full weight to it. Behind her, she could hear the controlled breathing of her teammates as they followed her example, everyone understanding that this was no place for haste or carelessness. The ledge seemed to stretch on forever, each step requiring complete concentration and precise foot placement. Halfway across the ledge, loose rock gave way under Sergeant Williams' feet. For a terrifying moment, he teetered on the edge of the cliff, his arms windmilling as he fought to regain his balance. Maria, moving just ahead of him, quickly braced herself and extended her hand to help stabilize him. Together, they managed to prevent what could have been a fatal fall, demonstrating the teamwork and mutual support that made elite units effective. The successful crossing of the ledge brought them to their final objective, a rocky prominence that provided commanding views of the entire valley system below. From this vantage point, they could observe enemy movements throughout the region and call in precise coordinates for airstrikes or artillery fire. It was the perfect location for their mission, but reaching it had cost them nearly everything they had. As they established their observation post and began setting up their equipment, Maria allowed herself a moment to appreciate what they had accomplished. The journey to this remote mountain peak had tested every aspect of their training and pushed them all to their physical and mental limits. But they had succeeded where lesser soldiers might have failed, proving once again the value of rigorous selection and intensive preparation. The radio crackled to life with reports from headquarters. Enemy forces throughout the region were on high alert, searching for the American team that had inflicted casualties during the day's fighting. Roadblocks had been established, patrols were sweeping the mountains, and a substantial reward had been placed on their heads. The situation was becoming increasingly dangerous, and extraction would be far more difficult than originally planned. As darkness began to fall over the Afghan mountains, Maria cleaned her weapon and prepared for what might be a very long night. The mission was far from over, and she had a growing sense that their greatest challenges still lay ahead. The enemy was closing in, and soon they would face a test that would push them beyond anything they had experienced before. The darkness of the Afghan night settled over the mountain peaks like a heavy blanket, bringing with it a bone-chilling cold that cut through even the best military gear. Maria huddled behind a rock formation at their observation post, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air as she maintained watch over the valley below. The temperature had dropped nearly 40 degrees since sunset, turning the already challenging environment into a test of survival. Their observation post provided excellent tactical advantages, but comfort was non-existent. The team had established defensive positions among the rocky outcroppings, creating overlapping fields of fire while maintaining concealment from enemy forces below. Maria's position gave her a commanding view of the main approach routes, her night vision scope turning the darkness into a green-tinted landscape where movement could be detected at considerable distances. For the past 3 hours, they had been calling in precise coordinates for airstrikes against enemy positions throughout the valley. The results had been devastating to the insurgent forces, with several weapons caches destroyed and multiple enemy strongpoints eliminated. But their success had come at a cost. Every radio transmission revealed their general location to enemy direction-finding equipment, and hostile forces were steadily closing in on their position. Lieutenant Commander Thompson had been monitoring enemy radio traffic through Sergeant Petrov's equipment, and the intelligence was deeply troubling. At least 3 separate enemy groups were converging on their area, with a combined strength estimated at over 50 fighters. The Americans were outnumbered more than 4 to 1, and their position, while tactically strong for observation, would become a trap if they were discovered and surrounded. The first indication that they had been found came at 0200 hours. Sergeant Williams, positioned at the eastern approach to their post, reported movement in the valley below. Through his night vision scope, he could see armed figures moving carefully up the mountain slopes, using the terrain for concealment as they advanced toward the American position. The enemy had found them, and contact was imminent. Maria felt her heart rate increase as the team prepared for what would likely be their most challenging fight yet. They had the advantages of elevation and superior training, but they were critically short on ammunition after the day's fighting, and there was no possibility of resupply or reinforcement. Whatever happened in the next few hours, they would have to handle it with whatever resources they currently possessed. The enemy attack began with a coordinated assault from 3 directions. Automatic weapons fire erupted from positions throughout the surrounding terrain, with tracers arcing through the darkness like deadly fireflies. The Americans responded immediately, their disciplined fire cutting down the first wave of attackers before they could reach effective range. But more kept coming, wave after wave of fighters willing to die to overrun the American position. Maria's rifle worked methodically, each shot carefully aimed at muzzle flashes and movement in the darkness below. Her marksmanship training served her well in the chaotic environment, allowing her to engage targets that her teammates might miss while conserving precious ammunition. Every round had to count, because once their ammunition was exhausted, the fight would be over. The battle raged for over an hour, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. The enemy fighters showed remarkable courage and determination, advancing repeatedly into devastating fire from the American positions. But they lacked the tactical sophistication and individual marksmanship skills of the elite soldiers they were attacking, and their casualties mounted steadily as the night wore on. Sergeant Kim had been moving constantly throughout the position, treating wounded team members and redistributing ammunition as needed. 2 of the SEALs had been hit by enemy fire, though neither wound was immediately life-threatening. The medic worked quickly and efficiently, applying field dressings and administering pain medication while continuing to engage enemy targets whenever the opportunity arose. As dawn approached, the intensity of the enemy attacks began to diminish. The insurgent forces had suffered enormous casualties throughout the night, with bodies scattered across the mountainside below the American position. But they had also succeeded in pinning down the elite team, preventing them from withdrawing to safety and forcing them to expend most of their remaining ammunition. Lieutenant Commander Thompson gathered the team leaders for a quick tactical conference as the first gray light of dawn illuminated the peaks around them. Their situation was desperate, but not hopeless. They had successfully completed their primary mission objectives, calling in devastating air strikes that had crippled enemy operations throughout the region. But they were now trapped on a remote mountain peak, low on ammunition, with wounded team members and enemy forces still surrounding their position. The decision was made to attempt a fighting withdrawal under cover of the pre-dawn darkness. They would move in 2 groups, with the wounded SEALs and essential equipment in the first group, followed by a rear guard that would delay any pursuit. It was a dangerous plan that required perfect timing and execution, but remaining in their current position would guarantee eventual defeat. Maria volunteered to serve in the rear guard, despite Lieutenant Commander Thompson's initial reluctance to place her in the most dangerous position. Her small size and demonstrated courage made her ideal for the delaying action they needed to conduct, and her marksmanship skills would be essential for breaking contact with pursuing enemies. After a brief discussion, the team leader accepted her recommendation. The withdrawal began in the pre-dawn twilight, with the first group moving carefully down the treacherous mountain slopes toward a distant ridge where helicopter extraction might be possible. Maria and 3 other soldiers remained behind, positioned to provide covering fire and delay enemy pursuit for as long as possible. Their job was to buy time for their wounded teammates to reach safety, regardless of the personal cost. As the sun rose higher, enemy forces began probing the American position, trying to determine whether it was still occupied or if the defenders had withdrawn during the night. Maria and her companions maintained strict fire discipline, revealing their positions only when absolutely necessary to prevent enemy advancement. Every shot had to serve multiple purposes, eliminating threats while conserving ammunition and maintaining the illusion of a larger defensive force. The deception worked for nearly 2 hours before enemy scouts discovered that most of the American force had departed. When this information reached the insurgent commanders, they immediately launched a massive assault designed to overrun the remaining defenders. Hundreds of fighters emerged from concealed positions throughout the valley, advancing in waves toward the rocky prominence where Maria and her teammates waited. The final battle was unlike anything Maria had experienced in her military career. Enemy fighters swarmed up the mountainside with reckless abandon, accepting enormous casualties in their determination to capture or kill the Americans who had inflicted so much damage on their forces. The 4 defenders fought with the desperation of soldiers who knew that surrender was not an option in this remote corner of Afghanistan. Maria's rifle barrel grew hot from continuous firing as she engaged target after target in the advancing enemy ranks. Her ammunition supply dwindled rapidly, forcing her to make every shot count while maintaining the rapid rate of fire needed to break up enemy assault formations. Around her, the other members of the rear guard fought with equal determination, their combined firepower creating a devastating kill zone that enemy fighters had to cross to reach their position. Sergeant O'Brien, the demolitions expert, had prepared several improvised explosive devices using materials from their equipment packs. As enemy fighters reached predetermined points in their advance, he detonated these charges with devastating effect. The explosions sent rock and metal fragments tearing through the ranks of attacking insurgents, buying precious seconds for the defenders to reload and reposition. But the math was inexorable. For soldiers, regardless of their training and equipment, could not indefinitely hold off hundreds of determined attackers. As the morning progressed, enemy forces gradually worked their way closer to the American position, using the rocky terrain for cover as they advanced. The defensive perimeter grew smaller and smaller, forcing the Americans into an increasingly desperate situation. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. A group of enemy fighters had worked their way around to the rear of the position, using a narrow ravine that had been difficult to observe during the darkness. Their sudden appearance behind the American lines caught everyone by surprise, forcing the defenders to fight in multiple directions simultaneously. In the confused melee that followed, disaster struck. Lieutenant Commander Thompson, attempting to reposition to meet the new threat, exposed himself to enemy fire and was hit multiple times by automatic weapons fire. He went down hard, his blood spreading across the rocky ground as Sergeant Kim rushed to provide medical assistance. The wounds were severe, and it was immediately clear that the team leader would be unable to continue fighting or move under his own power. The loss of their commander created an immediate leadership crisis in an already desperate situation. Sergeant O'Brien, as the senior non-commissioned officer, attempted to take charge, but he was pinned down by heavy enemy fire and unable to effectively coordinate the defense. Maria found herself in the crucial position of being the only team member with a clear view of all approaching enemy forces and the tactical mobility to respond to changing threats. Without hesitation, she took command of the deteriorating situation. Her voice carried clearly over the noise of battle as she directed defensive fires and coordinated the movements of her remaining teammates. Despite her junior rank and small stature, her demonstrated competence under fire and clear tactical thinking made her the natural choice to lead the desperate defense. The enemy forces, sensing victory, pressed their attacks with renewed vigor. They had identified the American command structure and were focusing their efforts on eliminating the remaining defenders before they could escape or call in additional support. The rocky prominence that had provided such excellent observation for their mission was rapidly becoming a tomb for the soldiers who had fought so courageously throughout the night. As ammunition ran dangerously low and enemy fighters closed to within meters of their position, Maria made a decision that would define the rest of her life. Rather than wait for the inevitable overrun of their position, she would attempt to save Lieutenant Commander Thompson's life by carrying him to safety. It was an almost impossible task. He outweighed her by nearly 100 pounds, and the journey to safety would cover 8 miles of the most treacherous terrain on Earth. The decision came to Maria in an instant of absolute clarity amid the chaos of battle. Lieutenant Commander Thompson was dying, and she was the only one who could save him. The wounded SEAL leader lay unconscious behind a blood-stained boulder, his breathing shallow, and his pulse weak from massive blood loss. Enemy fighters were less than 50 yards away and closing fast, their victory cries echoing across the rocky peaks. Without hesitation, Maria slung her rifle across her back and grabbed Thompson under his arms. At 6 feet 4 inches and weighing nearly 200 pounds, he was almost twice her size, but adrenaline and determination gave her strength she never knew she possessed. Grunting with effort, she managed to get him into a fireman's carry position across her shoulders, his dead weight threatening to drive her to her knees. Sergeant O'Brien and the remaining defenders provided covering fire as Maria began her desperate journey down the mountainside. Each step was agony, with Thompson's weight grinding her shoulders raw and threatening to send both of them tumbling into the abyss below. The loose rock shifted treacherously underfoot, and more than once she nearly lost her balance on the precipitous slope. The first mile was a nightmare of physical pain and constant terror. Enemy fighters had spotted her retreat and were pursuing down the mountain, their shots echoing off the rock walls around her. Bullets whined overhead and sparked off stones near her feet, but she kept moving, driven by a fierce determination to save the life of the man who had trusted her with his team's most dangerous missions. Her legs trembled with exhaustion as she navigated around massive boulders and across narrow ledges carved into the cliff face. Thompson's blood soaked through her uniform, and his weight seemed to increase with every step. But she refused to stop, refused to give up, refused to let a good man die on her watch. The Marine Corps motto, Semper Fidelis, meant always faithful, and she would be faithful to her teammate regardless of the cost. The terrain forced her to follow a winding route down the mountainside, adding precious miles to an already impossible journey. Steep ravines blocked direct paths, forcing her to backtrack and find alternate routes that added hours to her ordeal. Each detour brought its own challenges: loose rock that could trigger avalanches, hidden crevices that could swallow the unwary, and exposure to enemy fire from the peaks above. By the third mile, Maria's body was approaching complete breakdown. Her shoulders were on fire from Thompson's weight, her legs cramped from the constant strain of maintaining balance on treacherous footing, and her lungs burned from the thin mountain air. Dehydration was becoming a serious problem, but she had already consumed most of her water and couldn't spare any for the unconscious seal across her shoulders. The enemy pursuit had fallen behind, but she knew they hadn't given up. Occasionally, she could hear voices echoing from the peaks above, and once she spotted armed figures moving across a distant ridge. They were tracking her, waiting for exhaustion to force her to stop so they could close in for the kill. Her only advantage was her knowledge of American extraction procedures and rally points where friendly forces might be waiting. Thompson regained consciousness briefly during the fourth mile, mumbling incoherently about his family and his mission. Maria tried to reassure him, her voice hoarse from exertion and dehydration, promising him that they would make it out alive. His weight shifted on her shoulders as he tried to move, nearly sending both of them over the edge of a cliff, and she had to use all her remaining strength to maintain her balance. The SEAL team leader's condition was deteriorating rapidly. His breathing became more labored, and she could feel his body temperature dropping as shock set in from his massive injuries. She knew that time was running out, that even if she could somehow carry him the remaining distance to safety, he might not survive the journey. But she refused to give up, refused to accept defeat when a life hung in the balance. The fifth and sixth miles blurred together in a haze of pain and exhaustion. Maria's vision began to tunnel, her body's way of conserving energy for the essential functions needed to keep moving. She stumbled frequently now, catching herself at the last second to prevent catastrophic falls that would kill both of them. Her uniform was soaked with sweat despite the frigid mountain air, and her hands had gone numb from gripping Thompson's gear. Hallucinations began to creep into her consciousness as her body approached the absolute limits of human endurance. She thought she heard her mother calling her name, saw her brothers waving from distant peaks, imagined rescue helicopters that vanished when she looked directly at them. The line between reality and fantasy blurred, but somehow her legs kept moving, carrying her precious burden one step closer to salvation. The seventh mile nearly broke her. The terrain became even more treacherous as she descended toward the valley floor, with ice-covered rocks that offered no grip, and slopes so steep that a single misstep would mean certain death. Thompson's unconscious form had become dead weight across her shoulders, and she could no longer feel her feet inside her boots. Everything hurt, every muscle fiber screaming in protest, but still she continued. Darkness was falling when Maria finally reached the predetermined rally point where American forces should be waiting for extraction. Her legs gave out completely as she crested the final ridge, and she collapsed in a heap with Thompson still draped across her back. For long minutes, she lay motionless, gasping for breath and trying to summon the energy to call for help. Her radio had been damaged during the descent, leaving her with no way to communicate with friendly forces. But salvation came in the form of voices, American voices calling her name through the darkness. A search and rescue team had been deployed when the original extraction failed to make contact, and they had been combing the mountains looking for survivors. The sight of a small female soldier emerging from the peaks carrying a wounded SEAL was something none of them would ever forget. The rescue team's medic immediately began working on Lieutenant Commander Thompson, while others attended to Maria's injuries. She had suffered severe dehydration, exhaustion, and multiple cuts and bruises from her journey through the mountains. But she was alive, and more importantly, so was the man she had refused to leave behind. Her impossible 8-mile carry across some of the most treacherous terrain on Earth had succeeded against all odds. Thompson was evacuated by helicopter to a military hospital where surgeons worked for 12 hours to save his life. The bullets had caused massive internal damage, and his survival depended on the speed with which he had received medical attention. Maria's heroic journey had made the difference between life and death, giving the medical team the precious time they needed to repair his injuries. The story of the small female soldier who carried a wounded SEAL 8 miles through the Afghan mountains spread quickly through the military community. Maria's actions were recognized with the Silver Star, one of the nation's highest awards for valor in combat. But, for her, the real reward was a visit from Thompson's wife and children, who thanked her for bringing their husband and father home alive. The mission in the mountains had cost the team dearly, with several casualties and the loss of significant equipment. But their intelligence gathering and target designation had resulted in devastating strikes against enemy forces throughout the region. More importantly, it had demonstrated that courage and determination could overcome seemingly impossible odds when lives were at stake. Maria's military career continued for several more years, with assignments that took advantage of her proven leadership abilities and tactical expertise. She eventually retired as a sergeant major, having served with distinction in multiple combat zones and earning the respect of soldiers throughout the special operations community. Her example had opened doors for other women seeking to serve in elite units, proving that physical size was less important than strength of character. Years later, at Thompson's retirement ceremony, he publicly credited Maria with saving not just his life, but the lives of his entire family. Without her courage and determination, his wife would have become a widow and his children would have grown up without a father. The debt could never be repaid, but the bond between them would last forever, forged in the crucible of combat and sealed by an act of heroism that defined the very best of military service. The mountains of Afghanistan had tested Maria Rodriguez beyond anything she could have imagined when she first enlisted in the Army. But they had also revealed depths of courage and determination that she never knew she possessed. In carrying a wounded teammate to safety across 8 miles of the world's most treacherous terrain, she had proven that true heroism comes not from size or strength, but from an unbreakable commitment to never leave a fallen comrade behind. Her story became legend within the special operations community, told and retold to new generations of soldiers as an example of what it means to live by the warrior's code. In a profession where courage is common and heroism is expected, Maria Rodriguez had set a standard that would inspire others for decades to come. The small female soldier had become a giant among warriors, her name forever linked with the highest traditions of military service and sacrifice. The scars from that terrible night in the mountains never fully healed, both physical and emotional. But Maria carried them proudly, knowing that they represented the price of bringing a good man home to his family. In a world where heroes are often celebrated for fictional deeds, she had performed real heroism when it mattered most, proving that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when driven by love for their fellow soldiers and an unshakable commitment to doing what is right.